Tale Foundry. If you're a huge nerd like we are, and honestly, why else would you be here, then this month is probably pretty exciting for you. You see, the gods of television have seen fit to grant us a gift, something the like of which we have never before seen. Except for like 5 other times? Whatever, it's still exciting. The 6th season of Game of Thrones is coming. So, in order to celebrate our truly unhealthy obsession with the series, our April theme is about the world building in Game of Thrones. Although most of you have probably at least heard of it, not everyone has actually seen this series or read the books. For some, the content is just too objectionable, which I can totally understand. It's a pretty graphic story. So, just to keep everyone on the same page, we have our friend Val from the channel Because Geek with us to do a quick rundown of what exactly Game of Thrones is. Val?
Hey guys, so Game of Thrones is really hard to put into words. I'll just start by telling you that it's a TV show based on the A Song of Ice and Fire novels, written by George R. R. Martin, so he's the true genius behind the whole thing. The series is set in an expansive fictional world, and follows a cascade of events that begins with one small action that quickly spirals out of control, turning the world into a medieval war zone, where almost everyone is reaching for the throne. All the while, the one rightful ruler waits across the sea, planning to take back what is hers. But while Game of Thrones is considered a fantasy show, it's also much more complicated than your typical sword and sorcery, knights and dragons story, or your good versus evil story. It's a fully fledged world with normal human beings whose hearts are in constant conflict, and that's what makes Game of Thrones so relatable and so real. It's also mesmerizing how it's not just one story, but about 15 different stories being told all at once, each with extremely interesting characters whose plotlines are constantly intertwining with each other at different points. This does make it a bit difficult to follow at first, but oh so satisfying when you finally get the hang of it. All of that combined with a sprinkle of magic based around the two big natural opposites, ice and fire, makes the perfect combination.
As you can tell, it's not your average TV drama. It belongs to a genre that is, at least on television, criminally underrepresented. Fantasy. Sure, you get fantasy elements in successful shows like Supernatural or Buffy the Vampire Slayer, but the vast majority of recent shows that one might call fantasy are actually closer to urban fantasy. They take place in our world, not some other fictional world. There are a lot of reasons for this, both good and bad. For one, it's just really pricey to do. You're also asking a lot more of your audience from the outset, because they have to learn about the rules of your fictional world, which can make it harder for them to become engaged. But perhaps the most toxic reason fantasy is often brushed aside on TV? It's seen as a niche genre. It only appeals to children or to nerds looking for an escape from the real world. It's not relevant, it's not literary, it's just something that some people have fun with. Although, if that were true, then how in the world did Game of Thrones become the insane phenomenon that it is? I mean, this is a show that reached over 14 million viewers per episode in its last season alone. That's huge! It's even threatening to dethrone The Sopranos as HBO's most watched series of all time. And yet, it has all the hallmarks of those niche, irrelevant fantasy shows. Dragons? Check. Wizards? Check. Dudes with swords? Checks all over the place. And it's not even urban fantasy. It takes place in its own self-contained world. The success of Game of Thrones makes an excellent case for fantasy as a relevant, grown-up genre. It's definitely not a kids' show, and the appeal is obviously pretty wide. 14 million viewers is not a small audience. But this is more important than just being able to say, "Yeah, I told you fantasy is awesome." We're not just trying to prove a point about a genre we like here. The success of the fantasy genre matters to storytellers like us because fantasy is an important genre, especially fantasy that takes place in an alternate fictional world like Game of Thrones. Tolkien, the writer of Lord of the Rings and the granddaddy of modern fantasy, you know who he is, I don't know why I'm introducing him. He actually came up with a term to describe this sort of world within a story. He called the reality we live in the primary world, and the reality invented by the author, big surprise, the secondary world. And this is one of the great strengths of genres like fantasy, science fiction, and weird fiction. They allow us to view familiar situations from an emotional distance. When we're first introduced to a secondary world, we don't know enough about it to assume our real-world biases. We see dragons or magic and go, okay, this world clearly isn't like mine. Maybe its politics and religion aren't quite like mine either. And by this, our minds are split wide open, at least for a little while. And Game of Thrones makes use of this beautifully. Although the world is vastly different from ours and a lot of the situations the characters find themselves in are pretty fantastical, many of the series' conflicts are inherently human. The characters have the same basic fears, desires, and flaws that we have without all the trappings of our reality. We get to watch as characters give in to their forbidden lust and as they face the dire consequences. We see characters who neglect the great issues facing their world in order to focus on their own petty troubles. There are characters who struggle with power, integrity, failure, and somehow none of this feels preachy. It's just part of the story. You could watch the entire series and never once draw a parallel between what's happening on screen and what's happening in your life. Instead, because these human elements are all veiled by dragons and wizards and dudes with swords, you often find yourself reacting to them in ways that are wildly different from how you might react to similar situations in real life. For instance, over and over in Game of Thrones, we find ourselves backing the actions of protagonists even when all they're really doing is killing people to satisfy their own thirst for justice. On the flip side, there's at least one character in the series who we wish would do something terrible for his own good. If you've seen the show, you'll know exactly what I'm talking about. But the point of all of this isn't that secondary world settings will make you abandon your worldview. It's just that your worldview does happen to be a product of your world. And secondary worlds, like the one in Game of Thrones, allow us to step away from that, to think of things a little more objectively. And that is a powerful thing, especially in a genre that a lot of people feel is purely for entertainment. Stories with fantastical, otherworldly settings can be meaningful, and Game of Thrones proves that. If you've never seen the series and you don't mind a lot of nudity and a lot more blood, we can't recommend it enough. We're not saying you're guaranteed to love it, only that it's an interesting new standard for fantasy, so it's worth checking out. If you're already into Game of Thrones, you might want to check out our friend Val's channel, Because Geek. With plot predictions, footage analysis, and a tasteful amount of spoilers, if anyone can get you riled up for the new season, it's definitely her. As always, you can click subscribe if you want to see more thought fuel like this, or click submit if you have a story you want us to share. Thanks for watching, and keep making stuff up. I'll see you next time.